Case 1. Nathaniel Brazil. It was the last day of school before summer break, a time for celebration, water balloon fights, and the kind of carefree chaos that marks the end of 7th grade. For most students at Lake Worth Middle School, May 26, 2000, promised nothing more serious than cleaning out lockers and saying goodbye until fall. For 13-year-old Nathaniel Brazil, an honor student with perfect attendance, the day would end in a way no one could have imagined. By that afternoon, his favorite teacher would be dead, shot in the face at point-blank range, and Nathaniel would be in police custody, confessing to a crime that would make him one of the youngest people in Florida history to be tried as an adult for murder. Nathaniel Brazil seemed like the last kid anyone would expect to bring a gun to school. He maintained near-perfect attendance, earned good grades, and had no history of violence or serious discipline problems. Teachers described him as mild-mannered and likable. He was fascinated with law enforcement and the military, dreaming of one day becoming a Secret Service agent. He spent his free time playing simulated fighter pilot games and visiting military-related websites. To those who knew him casually, he appeared to be a typical middle schooler with big aspirations and a bright future ahead. Behind that image, however, lay a more complicated reality. Nathaniel's home life was far from stable. His mother, Polly Powell, worked as an assistant food services director at a retirement home, doing her best to provide for her son as a single parent. She had been involved in several abusive relationships over the years. Police records showed 17 domestic incident reports at their home in the 6 years leading up to the shooting. At one point, one of Powell's partners demanded that Nathaniel move out of the house entirely. The constant turmoil left its mark on the boy, even if teachers and classmates didn't fully grasp the extent of what he was dealing with at home. The week before the shooting, Nathaniel visited the Boynton Beach home of a man his family considered an unofficial grandfather. While there, he stole a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. In the days that followed, he showed the weapon to at least 2 classmates, but the teenagers didn't take it seriously. They couldn't imagine that quiet, mild-mannered Nathaniel would actually use it. Looking back, those moments represented missed opportunities, chances to intervene before tragedy struck. May 26th started like any other last day of a school. Students were excited, energy levels were high, and boundaries were tested. During his lunch period, Nathaniel slipped into a restroom and filled several water balloons. After lunch, he and about a dozen other students sparked a water balloon fight in the halls. When a counselor ran up to break it up, most of the students scattered. Nathaniel and a 13-year-old girl didn't run fast enough. They were caught. The consequences seemed minor at the time. Both were sent home for the day. It was hardly the worst punishment a middle schooler could face. For Nathaniel, however, being sent home early on the last day of school felt like an injustice he couldn't let stand. According to the girl who was suspended alongside him, Nathaniel made a chilling statement as they walked toward the school gate. He told her he planned to come back and shoot the counselor who had sent them home. "Just watch," he said. "I'll be all over the news." She didn't believe him. How could she? This was Nathaniel Brazil, the boy who wanted to protect the president someday. When Nathaniel arrived home, the house was empty. His mother was still at work. He knew exactly where the stolen gun was. He retrieved it, tucked it into his backpack, got on his bicycle, and rode back to Lake Worth Middle School. The building was mostly empty by then, with classes dismissed and most students already gone for the summer. Nathaniel made his way through the halls until he reached the classroom of Barry Grunow, his English teacher. Grunow was 35 years old, a well-liked educator who had a reputation for connecting with students. Nathaniel had received at least 2 D's and an F from Grunow over the course of the year, yet he later told investigators that Grunow was his favorite teacher. That detail would haunt everyone who tried to make sense of what happened next. Nathaniel approached Grunow's classroom and asked if he could speak to two female classmates who were inside. Grunow, aware that Nathaniel had been sent home earlier, refused. He told Nathaniel he couldn't come into the classroom. What happened in the seconds that followed was captured on the school's security cameras. Nathaniel pulled out the .25 caliber handgun and pointed it at his favorite teacher. Barry Grunow, standing in the doorway of his classroom, was shot once in the face. He collapsed to the floor as students inside the room screamed and scrambled for cover. Nathaniel fled the building, running down the hallway. He passed math teacher John James, pausing just long enough to wave the gun at him before continuing his escape. He made it out of the school and onto Wooden Road, where, within minutes, he flagged down a police cruiser. The officer behind the wheel was Mike Mahoney, someone Nathaniel knew from his neighborhood. Nathaniel fell to his knees in the street and confessed. "I shot someone," he said. "I shot my teacher." Inside the school, chaos had erupted. Teachers and students who heard the gunshot initially didn't know what had happened. When they found Barry Grunow bleeding in the doorway, teacher Brett Packard rushed to help. He cradled Grunow's head as blood poured from the wound, doing everything he could to keep the teacher alive until paramedics arrived. Despite their efforts, Barry Grunow was pronounced dead shortly after. A single bullet had ended his life in an instant. The last day of school, which should have been filled with laughter and celebration, had turned into a nightmare. Nathaniel was arrested without incident and taken into custody. During questioning, he showed what Sheriff Sonny Weatherford later described as a malevolent smirk. When asked about the shooting, Nathaniel admitted he had pointed the gun at Grunow, but he insisted it was an accident. His defense attorney, Robert Udell, would later argue that Nathaniel thought the gun's safety was on when he pointed it at the teacher. The bullet, Udell claimed, was never meant to fire. Nathaniel only wanted to scare Grunow into letting him see the two girls in the classroom, but prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that bringing a loaded gun to school, pointing it at a teacher, and pulling the trigger demonstrated intent, regardless of what Nathaniel claimed after the fact. In the aftermath of the shooting, the Brazil family and the community struggled to reconcile the image of Nathaniel they thought they knew with the reality of what he had done. His mother, Polly Powell, was devastated. "I was just numb," she told reporters. "It's too shocking to even imagine. The thought of your child, who you know you raised the best you can, has taken somebody's life." She and Nathaniel's father both insisted that their son was a good kid who had made a terrible mistake. They pointed to his troubled home environment, his fascination with weapons as a coping mechanism, and his youth as reasons to show mercy. The legal system, however, was not inclined toward mercy. Florida prosecutor Barry Krischer made the decision to try 13-year-old Nathaniel as an adult, charging him with first-degree murder. If convicted, Nathaniel would face life in prison, possibly becoming one of the youngest people in U.S. history to receive such a sentence. The case became a flashpoint in the national debate over how to handle violent juvenile offenders. In the early 1990s, Florida had amended its laws to make it easier to try youths as adults, responding to an alarming rise in juvenile crime. By 2000, the state had one of the harshest juvenile justice systems in the country. Nathaniel's case would test just how far that system was willing to go. Before the trial, prosecutors offered a plea deal. Nathaniel could plead guilty to second-degree murder and receive a sentence of 25 years. His family rejected the offer. They believed that taking the case to trial would allow them to present evidence of Nathaniel's troubled background and his claim that the shooting was accidental. It was a gamble that would prove costly. At trial, the prosecution presented a straightforward narrative. Nathaniel Brazil had been sent home from school for misbehavior. Angry and humiliated, he went home, retrieved a gun he had stolen days earlier, returned to school, and shot his teacher in cold blood. The jury heard testimony from witnesses who saw Nathaniel point the gun at Grunow. They watched surveillance footage that showed him fleeing the scene and waving the gun at another teacher. They learned that Nathaniel had confessed to the crime within minutes of being arrested. The defense tried to paint a picture of a troubled, immature boy who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They emphasized his age, his lack of a criminal record, and the chaotic environment he had grown up in. Nathaniel's attorney argued that he never intended to kill anyone, that the gun had gone off accidentally when he pointed it at Grunow, but the jury wasn't convinced. On May 16, 2001, after 14 hours of deliberation, they found Nathaniel guilty of second-degree murder and aggravated assault. He was 14 years old at the time of the verdict. The jury's decision to convict him of second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder suggested they believed there was some truth to the claim that the shooting wasn't fully premeditated. Still, the conviction carried serious consequences. On July 27, 2001, Nathaniel Brazil stood before Circuit Court Judge Richard Wennett for sentencing. Under Florida law, the judge was required to impose a minimum sentence of 25 years for second-degree murder involving a firearm. He could have imposed a life sentence. Nathaniel's family waited anxiously to hear what the judge would decide. In the end, Judge Wennett sentenced Nathaniel to 28 years in prison for the murder, plus an additional 5 years for aggravated assault, to be served concurrently. In total, Nathaniel would serve 28 years, just 3 years more than the minimum. He would be 41 years old before he could walk free. The courtroom reaction was muted. Nathaniel's mother, Polly Powell, wept quietly. Outside the courthouse, his father, Nathaniel Brazil Sr., told reporters he was grateful the sentence wasn't life without parole. "I know now my son will be coming home one day," Powell said. "The judge did pretty much what he had to do." She acknowledged that the sentence was harsh, but given Florida's mandatory sentencing laws, it could have been much worse. Nathaniel's family vowed to appeal the conviction, though they also expressed prayers for the Grunow family, who had lost a beloved husband, son, and brother. For the Grunow family, no sentence could undo the loss. Barry Grunow's widow, Pam, left the courthouse without commenting on the sentence. Later, her brother, Nick Locka, expressed disappointment. "I can't speak for all of the family, but I can tell you that it just wasn't enough time," he told reporters. Barry's sister, Kay Grunow, called the penalty an insult to Barry's memory. The family's pain was compounded by the knowledge that Nathaniel had shown little remorse. At his sentencing hearing, he apologized, but his words felt hollow to those who had loved Barry Grunow. The judge himself noted that Nathaniel had shown no genuine regret or understanding of the magnitude of what he had done. In the years that followed, Pam Grunow channeled her grief into action. She filed lawsuits against multiple parties, seeking accountability for her husband's death. She sued the Brazil family friend who owned the handgun Nathaniel had stolen, the Palm Beach County School Board, and the pawn shop that sold the weapon. These cases were settled for over $1 million. She also filed a lawsuit against the gun manufacturer, arguing that the company should be held liable for producing a weapon that ended up in the hands of a child. A jury initially awarded her $1.2 million, but the trial judge set aside the verdict. In 2005, the Florida District Court of Appeals upheld the judge's decision, and the case was dismissed. The legal battles brought Pam Grunow no peace, but they kept Barry's memory alive and forced the public to reckon with the systems that had failed to prevent his death. Nathaniel Brazil was initially held in a juvenile facility, but as he grew older, he was transferred into the adult prison system. Over the years, he has worked to better himself behind bars. He earned his GED and later obtained certification as a paralegal. He has been described by those who know him in prison as someone who has matured and reflected on his actions. Whether that reflection includes genuine remorse is something only Nathaniel can truly answer. He is currently incarcerated at the Quincy Annex in Florida. His release date is set for May 18, 2028, when he will be 41 years old. By then, he will have spent more than half his life in prison for a crime he committed at 13. The case of Nathaniel Brazil continues to spark difficult questions about how society should handle violent juvenile offenders. Some argue that trying a 13-year-old as an adult is inherently unjust, that children lack the cognitive development and impulse control of adults, and that the justice system should prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. They point to Nathaniel's troubled home life, his youth, and his lack of a prior criminal record as factors that should have kept him in the juvenile system. Others believe that the severity of the crime, taking an innocent life, demands serious consequences regardless of the offender's age. They argue that Barry Gruno's family deserves justice, and that means holding Nathaniel accountable as an adult. The tragedy at Lake Worth Middle School also raises uncomfortable questions about the adults who were supposed to protect both Nathaniel and Barry Gruno. How did a 13-year-old boy have access to a loaded handgun? Why didn't anyone take him seriously when he showed the gun to classmates in the days before the shooting? What kind of support system did Nathaniel have at home, given the documented history of domestic violence? Could better mental health resources, earlier intervention, or more attentive adults have prevented this tragedy? These are questions with no easy answers, but they linger nonetheless. Barry Gruno was 35 years old when he died. He was a dedicated teacher who cared about his students, even the ones who struggled. He had a wife who loved him, a family that cherished him, and a future that was cut short in the most senseless way. His death left a hole in the Lake Worth community that has never fully healed. Students who were in the building that day still carry the trauma of what they witnessed. Teachers who worked alongside Barry still remember the shock and grief that followed his death. And Pam Gruno, who lost her husband in an instant, has spent more than 2 decades advocating for change, hoping that no other family will have to endure what hers did. Nathaniel Brazil, now in his late 30s, has spent the majority of his life behind bars. He was a child when he committed his crime, but he will be middle-aged when he is finally released. The boy who dreamed of becoming a Secret Service agent, who earned good grades and had perfect attendance, threw away his future in a moment of anger and poor judgment. Whether that moment defines him forever, or whether he can find some measure of redemption, remains to be seen. What is certain is that 2 lives were destroyed on May 26, 2000. One ended by a bullet, the other consumed by the consequences of pulling the trigger. Even today, the name Nathaniel Brazil serves as a reminder of how quickly tragedy can unfold, and how the actions of a single moment can reverberate for decades. It forces us to confront the reality that children are capable of terrible violence, and that the line between a troubled kid and a killer can be terrifyingly thin. As Nathaniel Brazil counts down the years until his release, the question remains: at what point does a child who commits murder deserve a second chance? And at what point does justice for the victim demand that chance be denied? Case 2. Michael Carneal. It was a Monday morning in early December, the kind of cold, gray day common in western Kentucky as winter sets in. At Heath High School, students gathered in the lobby before classes began, some grabbing breakfast, others chatting with friends, and a small group huddled in a prayer circle near the hallway. December 1st, 1997, was the Monday after Thanksgiving break, and the school had the familiar buzz of students settling back into routine. Among them was 14-year-old Michael Carneal, a freshman who arrived that morning carrying more than just his backpack. Wrapped in a blanket and disguised as an art project, he brought a shotgun and a rifle. Hidden in his backpack was a loaded .22 caliber pistol. Within minutes, 3 teenage girls would be dead, 5 others wounded, and a small Kentucky community would be thrust into a nightmare that felt impossible to comprehend. Michael Carneal was not the kind of student who stood out in obvious ways. He was quiet, kept mostly to himself, and didn't belong to any particular social group. To many who knew him, he seemed like an average kid navigating the challenges of freshman year. He wasn't a troublemaker, didn't have a history of violence, and generally stayed under the radar. But beneath that unremarkable surface, Michael was struggling with something far more serious than typical teenage angst. He had been hearing voices in his head since he was 12 years old, voices that whispered, criticized, and commanded. He didn't tell anyone about them. He didn't know how to explain what was happening inside his mind, and so he suffered in silence. The voices were relentless. Michael heard 3 distinct ones, each with its own tone and purpose. They insulted him, told him he was worthless, and eventually began urging him to do terrible things. They told him to hurt people. They told him to kill. As the voices grew louder and more insistent, Michael became increasingly detached from reality. He developed paranoid delusions that consumed his thoughts. He believed that China was planning to invade the United States and that the government was doing nothing to stop it. He was convinced that the Walt Disney Corporation had implanted a microchip in his brain to control him. These weren't fleeting worries or teenage conspiracy theories. They were deeply held beliefs that shaped how Michael saw the world. He was living with undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that distorted his perception of reality and left him terrified, confused, and alone. Michael's fascination with weapons began early and intensified as he grew older. He was obsessed with guns, knives, and explosives. He spent hours researching firearms and imagining scenarios where he might need to defend himself or others. To Michael, these weren't just hobbies. They were preparations for the threats he believed were real. He also experienced bullying at school. Classmates teased him, made him feel small and powerless. The combination of untreated mental illness, bullying, and a growing fixation on violence created a dangerous spiral that no one around him fully recognized. On the morning of December 1st, Michael Carneal arrived at Heath High School with a plan. He had stolen the weapons from a neighbor's garage and brought them to school, telling anyone who asked that the blanket-wrapped bundle was an art project. Once inside the building, he made his way to the lobby, where students often gathered before the first bell. Near the hallway, a group of about 35 students had formed a prayer circle. They met there regularly, a quiet moment of faith before the chaos of the school day began. Michael approached the group, inserted earplugs into his ears to muffle the sound of gunfire, and pulled out the .22 caliber pistol. What happened next lasted less than a minute, but shattered countless lives. Michael raised the gun and fired 10 rounds in rapid succession. The shots echoed through the lobby as students screamed and scattered. Some dropped to the ground, unsure if they had been hit. Others ran for cover, their minds struggling to process what was happening. Michael fired with disturbing accuracy, hitting 8 students. 3 of them would not survive. Nicole Hadley was 14 years old, a freshman like Michael. She played in the school band and on the basketball team. She had moved to Paducah from Nebraska just the year before, and she was still building friendships and finding her place in a new community. Nicole was shot and kept alive on life support until 10 o'clock p.m. that evening, giving her family time to say goodbye. In a decision that would be praised by President Bill Clinton, her parents chose to donate her organs, a courageous act of generosity in the midst of unimaginable grief. Jessica James was 17, a senior with her whole future ahead of her. She was a member of the marching band and deeply involved in her school community. Jessica was shot and rushed into surgery at Western Baptist Hospital, but the wounds were too severe. She died that afternoon, her dreams and potential extinguished in an instant. Case Steger was 15, a sophomore who played clarinet in the school band and was active in the Agape Club and on the softball team. She was shot and succumbed to her injuries shortly after. Her family, like the families of Nicole and Jessica, was left to grapple with a loss that felt senseless and cruel. 5 other students were wounded in the attack. Missy Jenkins Smith, who was 15 at the time, was shot in the back. The bullet struck her spinal cord, leaving her paralyzed from the chest down. She has used a wheelchair ever since, her life permanently altered by a few seconds of violence. Holland Holm, 14, was shot in the side of the head. The wound required 13 staples to close, but he survived without permanent brain damage. Craig Keene, 5th, and 2 other students also sustained injuries, each carrying physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. After firing 10 rounds, Michael Carneal stopped. He lowered the gun, placed it on the ground, and stood there as students fled and teachers rushed toward him. Benjamin Strong, a member of the prayer group who had not been shot, later testified that Michael put the gun down of his own accord. No one wrestled it away from him. He simply stopped. When the school principal, Bill Bond, approached him, Michael didn't resist. He looked at Strong and said, "Kill me, please. I can't believe I did that." Within minutes, police arrived and took Michael into custody. He was arrested without incident, seemingly in shock at what he had just done. As investigators began piecing together what had happened, they struggled to understand why. Michael had no clear connection to the students he shot. He wasn't targeting anyone specific. He had simply opened fire on a group of kids who were praying. When asked about his motive, Michael couldn't provide a coherent answer. He mentioned feeling bullied, believing his parents didn't love him, and being taunted by classmates who falsely claimed he was gay. But none of those explanations felt adequate for the horror he had inflicted. The community of Paducah was devastated. In 1997, school shootings were not yet a regular feature of American life. Columbine was still more than a year away. The idea that a student could walk into a school and open fire on his classmates felt like something from a nightmare, not reality. Families struggled to explain to their children what had happened. Teachers grappled with their own trauma while trying to support grieving students. Vigils were held, memorial services planned, and a community tried to make sense of the senseless. As the case moved through the legal system, the focus shifted to Michael's mental state. Psychiatric evaluations revealed what many had suspected. Michael was severely mentally ill. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that explained the voices, the delusions, and the distorted thinking that had consumed him. Experts testified that Michael had been suffering from this illness for years without treatment, and that on the day of the shooting, he was not fully in control of his actions. The voices in his head had been commanding him to kill, and in his fractured mental state, he believed he had no choice but to obey. In October 1998, Michael Carneal entered a guilty plea. Under a plea arrangement, the judge agreed to accept the pleas on the condition that Michael would receive a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Prosecutor Tim Kaltenbach explained that the plea allowed Michael to receive mental health treatment during his imprisonment for as long as necessary. Michael was 14 years old when he committed the crime, but Kentucky law at the time allowed for juveniles aged 14 and older to be sentenced as adults for serious offenses. The sentence meant that Michael would spend at least a quarter of a century behind bars before he could even be considered for release. Michael was initially held at the Northern Kentucky Youth Development Center, a juvenile facility, until he turned 18. He was then transferred to the Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange, where he has remained ever since. Over the years, Michael has received treatment for his schizophrenia. He takes 3 medications to manage his symptoms, and by most accounts, he has worked hard to better himself. He earned educational credentials, participated in prison programs, and, according to those who know him, has shown genuine remorse for what he did. But the voices never fully went away. Even with medication and treatment, Michael continues to hear them. They tell him to hurt himself, to jump down stairways, to end his life. He has learned to resist them, to recognize them as symptoms of his illness rather than commands he must follow. But their presence is a constant reminder that his mental illness is not cured, it is only managed. And that reality would prove crucial when, after nearly 25 years, Michael Carneal became eligible for parole. In September 2022, Michael faced a parole hearing, one of the first instances in U.S. history where a school shooter had the opportunity to be released. The hearing drew intense scrutiny. Victims, their families, and community members packed the proceedings, many speaking passionately about the pain Michael had caused and the ongoing impact of his actions. Missy Jenkins Smith, who has spent 25 years in a wheelchair because of Michael's bullet, addressed the parole board. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years, she said. Also on December 1, 1997, Michael sentenced me to life in a wheelchair without the possibility of parole ever. Nicole Hadley's parents and siblings spoke of their loss, of the daughter and sister they would never see grow up, get married, or have children. They expressed fear that if Michael were released, he could harm others. Jessica James's family and Case Steger's loved ones echoed those concerns. The overwhelming sentiment from the victims and their families was that Michael should remain in prison for the rest of his life. Michael's defense attorney, Alana Meyer, argued that Michael had been a child suffering from severe, undiagnosed mental illness at the time of the shooting. She emphasized that he had committed himself to mental health treatment, educational programs, and becoming a positive person within the prison. She pointed out that Michael had shown deep, genuine remorse and had taken responsibility for his actions. His father, John Carneal, pleaded for his son's release, offering to take Michael into their home and ensure he continued receiving treatment. Michael himself addressed the parole board. He spoke about the voices he still hears, admitting that just days before the hearing they had told him to throw himself down a stairway. He acknowledged that he struggles with paranoid thoughts with violent imagery, but insisted he could resist them now. He expressed sorrow for what he had done and said he wanted to do something good for society, even if it was just listening to people. But when asked if he deserved parole, Michael's answer was telling. "I don't know," he said. "Sometimes I think I deserve to be killed." The parole board weighed all of this, the voices that persisted, the victim's suffering, Michael's remorse, and the question of whether someone who still hears commands to harm himself could be safely released. On September 26, 2022, the Kentucky Parole Board unanimously denied Michael Carneal's request for parole. More than that, they voted to have him serve out his life sentence, a ruling that means Michael will never be considered for parole again. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. The decision brought relief to the victims and their families, though it did little to ease the pain they carry every day. For Michael, now 39 years old, the ruling meant that the hope he had held for a second chance was gone. He will die in prison, a consequence of actions he committed as a mentally ill 14-year-old. The case of Michael Carneal raises difficult questions that have no easy answers. Should a teenager suffering from severe, untreated mental illness be held to the same standard of accountability as a fully functioning adult? Can someone who was hearing voices commanding him to kill be considered truly culpable for following those commands? On the other hand, does the severity of the crime, 3 young lives taken, 5 others forever altered, demand a punishment that extends for a lifetime, regardless of the offender's age or mental state? Missy Jenkins Smith has been remarkably open about her journey. In 2007, she met with Michael in prison and had a long, emotional conversation. He apologized to her, and she told him she had forgiven him. But forgiveness, she has made clear, does not mean she believes he should be released. She worries that Michael is not equipped to handle life outside of prison, that his ongoing mental illness makes him a risk, and that it would be unjust for him to walk free while she and others continue to suffer the consequences of his actions. The devastation Michael Carneal caused on December 1st, 1997, forced uncomfortable truths into public conversation. It revealed how vulnerable schools were to violence, how mental illness in adolescents could go undetected and untreated, and how a single moment of horror could ripple through generations. The shooting at Heath High School occurred 16 months before the massacre at Columbine, at a time when Americans were just beginning to understand that school shootings could happen anywhere, to anyone. In the years since, the victims' families have worked to honor the memories of Nicole, Jessica, and Case. Memorial stands on the Heath High School campus, a quiet place where students and community members can reflect on the lives lost. The families received a $42 million settlement, though no amount of money could ever compensate for what was taken from them. Michael Carneal remains at the Kentucky State Reformatory, where he will spend the rest of his days. He continues to take his medications, continues to hear the voices, and continues to live with the knowledge of what he did. Whether he is a monster who deserves to die in prison or a victim of a broken mind who committed an unforgivable act is a question that people will answer differently depending on their values, their experiences, and their beliefs about justice and mercy. What is certain is that on a cold December morning in 1997, 8 students were shot, 3 families lost their children, and a community sense of safety was shattered. The name Michael Carneal is now forever linked to that tragedy, a reminder that even children can be capable of terrible violence, and that the line between illness and evil is far more complicated than we often want to admit. Case 3, Kip Kinkle. On May 21, 1998, students at Thurston High School filed into the cafeteria for breakfast, chatting about the school day ahead and making plans for the approaching summer. It was a Thursday morning in the small town of Springfield, a working-class community just east of Eugene in Oregon's Willamette Valley. The cafeteria was crowded and loud, filled with the familiar sounds of teenagers laughing, trays clattering, and voices echoing off the walls. Then, at approximately 8 o'clock a.m., 15-year-old Kip Kinkle walked through the doors carrying a semi-automatic rifle. He raised the weapon and began firing into the crowd. Students scattered, diving under tables and running for exits as bullets tore through the room. Within minutes, 2 students were dead, 25 others were wounded, and the carnage might have continued if not for a wounded student who tackled Kinkle to the ground. But the horror at Thurston High School was only half the story. At Kinkle's home just a few miles away, police would discover the bodies of his parents, shot dead the day before. In less than 24 hours, Kip Kinkle had murdered 4 people and shattered a community's sense of safety forever. Kipland Kinkle was born on August 30, 1982, the second child of William and Faith Kinkle. His older sister, Kristen, was a gifted student who excelled academically and set a high bar for achievement. By all accounts, the Kinkles were loving, supportive parents who valued education and wanted the best for their children. William had been a Spanish teacher at Thurston High School and Lane Community College before retiring. Faith still taught Spanish at Springfield High School at the time of her death. They were respected educators, dedicated to their students and their community. They spent a sabbatical year in Spain when Kip was 6, hoping to immerse their children in language and culture. But for young Kip, the experience was difficult. He attended a Spanish-speaking kindergarten and struggled to keep up. His family later said he attended school in an abnormal way, and when they returned to Oregon, it became clear that Kip was facing challenges his sister had never encountered. Kip attended elementary school in the small community of Walterville, about 5 miles east of Springfield. His teachers noticed early on that he was immature and seemed to lack the physical and emotional development of his peers. Based on their recommendations, Kip's parents made the difficult decision to have him repeat first grade. During that year, he was diagnosed with dyslexia, a learning disorder that made reading and writing significantly harder for him. The diagnosis explained some of his struggles, and he was placed in extensive special education classes by the beginning of second grade. Despite the support, school remained a challenge for Kip. He worked hard, but learning never came as easily to him as it did to his sister. He felt the weight of comparisons and the frustration of always being a step behind. As Kip entered adolescence, a darker pattern began to emerge. He developed an intense fascination with firearms and explosives. It started young and only grew stronger as he got older. He began making bombs, mostly gasoline-based, and detonating them in a nearby quarry. He later said he did this to assuage his anger, a troubling sign that something deeper was wrong. His father, recognizing Kip's interest in guns, tried to channel it in what he hoped was a constructive direction. He taught Kip how to shoot, took him to firing ranges, and eventually purchased firearms for him, including a .22 single-shot rifle that William had received when he was 12. Faith was initially uncomfortable with the idea of guns in the house, but Kip's psychologist at the time gave her what she later described as emotional permission to say yes. The family believed that teaching Kip responsible gun use and allowing him to explore his interests under supervision was better than trying to suppress them. It was a decision they would come to regret. What the Kinkles didn't know, what no one knew, was that Kip had been hearing voices in his head since he was 12 years old. These were not fleeting thoughts or the typical anxieties of adolescence. They were distinct, persistent, and terrifying. Kip heard 3 different voices, each with its own tone and message. They berated him, told him he was worthless, and eventually began commanding him to do unthinkable things. The voices told him to kill everyone in the world. They whispered that he had no choice, that violence was inevitable, that he had to act. Kip tried to ignore them, tried to push them away, but they only grew louder and more insistent. Along with the voices came paranoid delusions that consumed his thinking. Kip became convinced that China was planning to invade the United States and that the government was doing nothing to stop it. He believed the Walt Disney Corporation had implanted a microchip in his brain to control his thoughts and actions. These weren't passing worries or teenage conspiracy theories. They were deeply held beliefs that shaped how Kip saw the world. He was living with undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that distorted his perception of reality and left him in a constant state of fear and confusion. He told no one about the voices or the delusions. He didn't know how to explain what was happening inside his mind, and he was terrified of what people would think if he tried. At Thurston High School, Kip's behavior raised red flags. Classmates described him as strange and morbid. Some called him psychotic or schizoid. He constantly talked about committing acts of violence, telling friends he wanted to join the U.S. Army after graduation to find out what it was like to kill someone. When asked about a family trip to Disneyland, he commented that he wanted to punch Mickey Mouse in the nose. He once gave a how-to speech on bomb-making to his speech class, complete with instructions. He set off stink bombs in classmates' lockers. Teachers and students alike noticed that something was off, but no one connected the dots. No one realized that Kip was descending into a psychotic break. On May 20th, 1998, everything came to a head. The day before, Kip had been caught at school with a stolen handgun. A classmate had agreed to sell him the weapon, and Kip brought it to campus. When school officials discovered the gun, they immediately called the police. Kip was arrested, and his father was notified. William Kinkle arrived at the police station to pick up his son, and the disappointment and anger on his face were unmistakable. Kip had been expelled from Thurston High School. His future, which had already seemed uncertain, now felt completely derailed. As they drove home in silence, Kip knew what was waiting for him: a difficult conversation, consequences he couldn't escape, and the crushing weight of his father's disappointment. When they arrived home, Kip went to his room. The voices in his head were screaming now, louder than they had ever been. They told him there was only one way out. Shortly after they got home, Kip retrieved a .22 caliber rifle, walked into the kitchen where his father was sitting, and shot him in the back of the head. William Kinkle died instantly. Kip covered his father's body with a sheet and waited. Hours later, when his mother came home from her teaching job, Kip was waiting for her. As Faith entered the house, Kip shot her multiple times. She collapsed in the garage. Kip dragged her body inside and covered it as well. For the rest of the evening and into the night, Kip remained in the house with his parents' bodies. He left a note on his father's chest. "I love you, Dad." He wrote another note that would later be found by police, a rambling, anguished confession in which he tried to explain what he had done. "I have just killed my parents," he wrote. "I don't know what is happening. I love my mom and dad so much. I just got 2 felonies on my record. My parents can't take that. It would destroy them. The embarrassment would be too much for them. They couldn't live with themselves." He went on to describe the voices, the compulsion to kill, and his belief that what he had done was somehow merciful. "I had to. I had no other choice." But Kip wasn't finished. That night, he set small fires in the house, though they didn't spread significantly. He packed a duffel bag with ammunition, explosives, and additional weapons. He loaded his .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle and prepared for what he planned to do next. The voices told him he had to keep going. He had to kill more people. On the morning of May 21st, Kip drove his mother's car to Thurston High School. He parked in the student lot, grabbed his rifle and ammunition, and walked toward the building. The cafeteria was crowded when Kip entered. He wasted no time. He raised the rifle and began firing into the crowd of students. Chaos erupted instantly. Students screamed, dropped to the floor, and scrambled for cover. Some didn't realize what was happening at first. The sound of gunfire in a school cafeteria was so foreign, so impossible, that their minds struggled to process it. Kip fired 51 rounds in total, moving methodically through the room and reloading as needed. He shot students at close range, his face expressionless, as if he were detached from the horror he was creating. Ben Walker and Michael Nicholson, both 16-year-old sophomores, were killed in the cafeteria. Ben was a popular student, well-liked, and full of potential. Miko was remembered for his kindness and his love of sports. Both died in the place they came to learn, surrounded by classmates who could do nothing but watch in terror. 25 other students were wounded, some critically. The injuries ranged from gunshot wounds to the chest, back, and limbs, to wounds sustained in the frantic scramble to escape. The cafeteria became a scene of carnage, blood pooling on the floor as students tried to help the wounded while avoiding more gunfire. Kip might have killed many more if not for the actions of a wounded student named Jake Riker. Despite being shot, Riker and several other students tackled Kip to the ground as he tried to reload. They wrestled the rifle away from him and held him down until teachers and police arrived. Kip struggled and pulled out a knife, slashing at the students who restrained him, but they didn't let go. Their bravery likely saved dozens of lives. Within minutes, police swarmed the school. Kip was taken into custody, and the wounded were rushed to hospitals. As investigators began processing the scene, they received a call from a neighbor of the Kinkle family. Someone had noticed the small fires at the Kinkle home and reported smoke. When police arrived at the house, they discovered the bodies of William and Faith Kinkle. The horror at Thurston High School suddenly took on an even darker dimension. Kip hadn't just shot his classmates, he had killed his own parents first. The community of Springfield was devastated. At the time, the Thurston shooting was one of the deadliest school attacks in U.S. history. It preceded the massacre at Columbine High School by less than a year, occurring at a moment when Americans were just beginning to grapple with the reality that schools were no longer safe havens. President Bill Clinton visited Thurston High School a month later to speak about school violence and the need for prevention. Vigils were held, memorials erected, and families tried to make sense of a tragedy that felt senseless. As Kip's case moved through the legal system, the focus turned to his mental state. Psychiatric evaluations revealed what many suspected. Kip was severely mentally ill. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that explained the voices, the delusions, and the fractured thinking that had consumed him. Experts testified that Kip had been hearing voices commanding him to kill since he was 12, and that, on the days of the murders, he genuinely believed he had no choice but to obey them. His defense attorneys argued that Kip was not legally sane at the time of the attacks and that he should be treated, not simply punished. But Oregon law was not sympathetic to that argument. In 1994, Oregon voters had approved Measure 11, a tough-on-crime initiative that mandated minimum prison sentences for certain violent crimes and required that juveniles aged 15 and older be tried as adults for offenses like murder. The law was designed to hold young offenders accountable and to send a message that serious crimes would result in serious consequences. Kip Kinkle became one of the most high-profile cases tried under Measure 11. In 1999, Kip entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of murder and 26 counts of attempted murder. Under the plea agreement, he was sentenced to 111 years and 8 months in prison, a de facto life sentence. He was 17 years old at sentencing. The courtroom was filled with victims, their families, and community members. For hours, survivors gave statements about the physical and emotional pain Kip had caused. They described surgeries, infections, permanent nerve damage, and the psychological trauma of living through a mass shooting. Many asked the judge to ensure that Kip would never walk free. Kip himself spoke briefly at the sentencing. His voice was flat, almost robotic. "I have spent days trying to figure out what I want to say," he told the court. "I have crumpled up dozens of pieces of paper and disregarded even more ideas. I have thought about what I could say that might make people feel just a little bit better. But I have come to the realization that it really doesn't matter what I say." His words offered little comfort to those who had lost loved ones or who would carry scars for the rest of their lives. Kip was initially held at a juvenile facility, but when he turned 18, he was transferred to the Oregon State Correctional Institution in Salem, where he remains today. Over the years, Kip has worked to better himself. He earned his GED while in juvenile detention and later completed a college degree behind bars. He has participated in educational and vocational programs, and those who know him in prison say he has shown genuine remorse for his actions, but the voices never went away. Even with medication and decades of treatment, Kip still hears them. They tell him to harm himself, to end his life. He has learned to resist them, but their presence is a constant reminder that his illness is managed, not cured. For more than 2 decades, Kip Kinkle remained silent. He declined all interview requests, avoided media attention, and focused on serving his sentence. But in 2021, he broke that silence. He agreed to speak with a reporter from HuffPost for a series of in-depth interviews conducted over 10 months. In those conversations, Kip expressed what he called tremendous shame and guilt for what he had done. He talked about the voices, the delusions, and the terror of living with a fractured mind. He explained that he had spent years trying to understand his own actions and to come to terms with the harm he had caused. But Kip's decision to speak publicly wasn't just about his own story. He explained that he had stayed silent for so long out of respect for his victims, not wanting to cause them further pain. However, he had come to realize that his silence was being used against other juvenile offenders who were seeking second chances. In 2019, Oregon passed Senate Bill 1008, a landmark piece of legislation aimed at reforming juvenile sentencing. The bill stopped the automatic referral of 15 to 17-year-olds to adult court for certain offenses and ensured that juveniles wouldn't be sentenced to life in prison without a chance to seek parole. It was a significant step toward recognizing that children, even those who commit serious crimes, are different from adults and deserve opportunities for rehabilitation. But the bill included a critical exception. Those who had been sentenced before the law passed, people like Kip Kinkle, were excluded from its protections. Prosecutors and victims' families had used Kip's case as an example of why such reforms were dangerous, arguing that some juvenile offenders were too dangerous to ever be released. Kip watched as his friends and fellow inmates, some of whom had committed less serious crimes than he had, were denied the chance for resentencing. "I have responsibility for the harm that I caused when I was 15, Kip said in the interview, but I also have responsibility for the harm that I am causing now as I'm 38 because of what I did at 15. He spoke out, he said, because he hoped that by sharing his story, he might help others who still had a chance at a second life. Kip's case continues to be challenged in the courts. His attorneys have argued that his sentence is unconstitutional, that sentencing a juvenile to die in prison because he suffers from a severe mental illness violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They have pointed to Supreme Court rulings in cases like Miller versus Alabama, which held that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles are unconstitutional. But so far, those arguments have not succeeded. The Oregon Supreme Court upheld Kip's sentence, and efforts to bring the case to the U.S. Supreme Court have been unsuccessful. The families of Ben Walker and Michael Nicolason, the students killed in the cafeteria, have made clear that they do not believe Kip should ever be released. They argue that the severity of his crimes, 4 people murdered, 25 others wounded, demands a lifetime behind bars. They point out that their loved ones don't get a second chance, and neither should Kip. For them, justice means ensuring that Kip Kinkle dies in prison, just as their children died in a school cafeteria. The case of Kip Kinkle forces us to confront deeply uncomfortable questions. Can a 15-year-old suffering from severe, untreated paranoid schizophrenia be held fully accountable for actions driven by voices and delusions? Should a mentally ill teenager be sentenced to die in prison even if he has spent decades working toward rehabilitation and shows genuine remorse? On the other hand, does the magnitude of the harm, 4 lives taken, dozens more forever changed, demand a punishment that extends for a lifetime, regardless of the offender's age or mental state? There are no easy answers. Kip Kinkle's story is one of profound tragedy on multiple levels. 4 people are dead because of him. 25 others carry physical and emotional scars. A community was shattered, but Kip himself was a victim too, a victim of a broken mind, of an illness that went undiagnosed and untreated, of a system that didn't recognize the warning signs until it was too late. That doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't erase the harm, but it complicates the question of justice. Today, Kip Kinkle is 42 years old. He has spent more than half his life in prison. He will die there, barring some extraordinary legal intervention. The voices are still with him, a constant reminder of the illness that stole his future and the lives of 4 innocent people. He has earned a college degree, participated in prison programs, and by all accounts, tried to become a better person. But none of that can undo May 20th and 21st, 1998. The memory of the Thurston High School shooting continues to influence discussions about school safety, mental health, and juvenile justice. A memorial stands outside Thurston High, honoring Ben Walker and Mikhail Nicolason. Their names are remembered, their lives celebrated, their loss mourned, and the name Kip Kinkle remains a symbol of one of the darkest chapters in Oregon's history, a reminder that untreated mental illness, access to weapons, and a failure to intervene can converge in the most devastating ways imaginable. Case 4. Philip Chisholm, October 22, 2013, began as an ordinary Tuesday at Danvers High School, a sprawling brick building in a quiet Massachusetts town about 20 miles north of Boston. Students filed into afternoon classes, teachers wrapped up lessons, and the school day wound toward its familiar close. In room 138B, 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer was teaching algebra to her 9th grade class. Miss Ritzer, as her students called her, was in her first year of teaching, but she had already become beloved by students and colleagues alike. She was energetic, patient, and genuinely passionate about helping kids understand math. She stayed after school regularly to tutor students who needed extra help, and she decorated her classroom with colorful posters meant to make learning feel less intimidating. That Tuesday afternoon, she had no reason to think anything was wrong. One of her students, a quiet 14-year-old named Philip Chisholm, sat in her classroom as he did every day. He was polite, reserved, and seemed like a normal freshman. By the end of the day, Colleen Ritzer would be dead, and Philip Chisholm would be on the run, her blood on his clothes and her body hidden in the woods behind the school. Philip Chisholm had moved to Danvers earlier that year, relocating from Clarksville, Tennessee, after his parents separated. The move was difficult for him. He had left behind friends, familiarity, and the only home he had known. In Massachusetts, he was the new kid, trying to adjust to a different school, a different climate, and a life that had been upended by his parents' breakup. To those who met him, Philip seemed like a nice, polite teenager. He was quiet, kept to himself, and didn't cause trouble. He played on the freshman soccer team, and coaches and teammates described him as a decent player who worked hard and got along with others. Teachers at Danvers High saw him as a respectful student who didn't stand out for any negative reasons. If anything, he seemed withdrawn, perhaps still adjusting to his new surroundings. No one suspected that behind his calm, polite exterior, something dark was brewing. On the afternoon of October 22nd, Colleen Ritzer's algebra class was routine. She taught the lesson, answered questions, and engaged with her students the way she always did. At some point during the class, she made an offhand comment about Tennessee. The exact context isn't entirely clear. It may have been related to a word problem, a casual conversation, or simply a reference that came up organically. To anyone else in the room, it was an unremarkable moment, but to Philip Chisholm, it felt like something more. Later, investigators would theorize that the mention of Tennessee, his former home, the place he had been forced to leave, triggered something in him, whether it was anger, sadness, or some dark impulse that had been building. No one can say for certain. What is clear is that by the end of the school day, Philip had decided to follow his teacher. When the final bell rang, most students packed up their things and headed home. Colleen Ritzer remained in her classroom as she often did, preparing for the next day and making herself available to students who needed help. Surveillance footage from inside the school would later show Philip Chisholm lingering in the hallways, waiting. Around 3:00 p.m., he followed Colleen Ritzer into a second-floor girls' bathroom. What happened next was captured only in fragments, bits of evidence pieced together by investigators, forensic analysis, and Philip's own later admissions. Inside that bathroom, Philip attacked his teacher. He raped her. He beat her. He slashed her throat with a box cutter, cutting so deeply that it was clear he intended to kill her. Colleen Ritzer, a young woman who had dedicated her life to helping students, was murdered in the place where she worked by a student she had tried to teach. After killing her, Philip did not panic. He did not run. Instead, he acted with chilling calculation. He placed Colleen's body in a large recycling bin, the kind schools use for paper and cardboard. He wheeled it through the hallways and out of the building, moving carefully to avoid drawing attention. Surveillance cameras captured him pushing the bin across the campus and into the wooded area behind the school. There he dumped Colleen's body into a drainage ditch, covered it with leaves and branches, and placed a crude cross made of sticks on top of her. Whether the cross was meant as some form of twisted respect or simply part of the ritual of what he had done, investigators could only speculate. Philip then returned to the school, changed his clothes, and stole Colleen Ritzer's credit cards, driver's license, and other personal items. He discarded his blood-stained clothes in the woods and put on clean ones he had apparently brought with him. Surveillance footage from later that evening showed Philip walking calmly through Danvers, his demeanor unremarkable. He went to a movie theater and watched a film. He stopped at a Wendy's and ordered food. To anyone who saw him, he was just another teenager out on a Tuesday night. No one would have guessed that hours earlier he had committed one of the most brutal crimes the town of Danvers had ever seen. Colleen Ritzer's family became worried when she didn't come home that night. It wasn't like her to be out of touch, and when calls to her phone went unanswered, they knew something was wrong. They reported her missing, and police immediately began investigating. Surveillance footage from the school provided the critical lead. Officers saw the images of Philip Chisholm pushing a large recycling bin out of the building and into the woods. They also noticed that he had changed clothes between earlier footage and later footage, a red flag that suggested he had something to hide. Police quickly identified Philip as a person of interest and began searching for him. Meanwhile, Philip had left. Philip had Danvers. He walked along Route 1, a major highway, heading north. He was picked up by police around 12:30 a.m. on October 23rd, walking along the roadside in the neighboring town of Topsfield. When officers approached him, he was carrying a backpack that contained Colleen Ritzer's identification, credit cards, and a pair of women's underwear stained with blood. He also had the box cutter he had used to kill her. Philip was taken into custody, and within hours, police used his information to locate Colleen's body in the woods behind the school. The discovery confirmed what investigators had feared. Colleen Ritzer was dead, and the quiet, polite freshman who had seemed so unremarkable was responsible. The town of Danvers was devastated. Colleen Ritzer had been a bright light in the community, a young woman full of promise who had chosen teaching because she genuinely wanted to make a difference. She had graduated from Assumption College with a degree in mathematics and a minor in psychology, and she had just begun what everyone believed would be a long and impactful career. Her students adored her. Her colleagues respected her. Her family loved her deeply, and now she was gone, murdered by a 14-year-old student she had tried to help. As the case moved through the legal system, the question of how to charge Philip Chisholm became a central issue. He was 14 years old at the time of the crime, but the brutality of what he had done, the rape, the murder, the calculated cover-up, suggested a level of premeditation and malice that seemed incompatible with his age. Prosecutors made the decision to charge Philip as an adult. He was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and armed robbery. If convicted, he would face life in prison. Before the trial, a competency evaluation was ordered to determine whether Philip was mentally fit to stand trial. The evaluation found that he was competent, that he understood the charges against him and could assist in his own defense. The findings did not, however, address the question of why he had committed such a horrific crime. What could drive a 14-year-old boy, described by everyone who knew him as quiet and polite, to rape and murder his teacher? Psychiatrists and psychologists searched for answers, but Philip himself offered little insight. He was withdrawn, uncommunicative, and seemed emotionally detached from the gravity of what he had done. While awaiting trial, Phillip's behavior continued to raise alarms. In June 2014, while incarcerated at a juvenile detention facility, he attacked a corrections officer. He waited until the officer was alone, then assaulted her, attempting to choke her and making sexually inappropriate comments. The attack was stopped by other staff members, but it underscored a troubling reality. Phillip Chisholm was not simply a boy who had made one terrible mistake. He was someone with a capacity for continued violence, particularly against women. Investigators also discovered disturbing drawings in Phillip's possession. He had sketched images of a female figure, with notes referencing a good teacher and stabbing. The drawings suggested that he had been thinking about violence, perhaps even fantasizing about it, before the attack on Colleen Ritzer. Combined with the attack on the corrections officer, the evidence painted a picture of a young man who posed an ongoing threat. The trial began in late 2015. Prosecutors presented a detailed timeline of the crime, supported by surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and testimony from investigators. They argued that Phillip Chisholm had acted with premeditation and extreme cruelty. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage showed him following Colleen into the bathroom, pushing the recycling bin out of the school, and changing clothes. DNA evidence confirmed that he had raped her. The box cutter, still stained with her blood, was found in his backpack, along with her stolen identification and credit cards. The defense did not dispute that Phillip had killed Colleen Ritzer. Instead, they argued that he was suffering from a severe mental illness at the time of the crime and that he should not be held fully responsible for his actions. They presented expert testimony suggesting that Phillip had experienced a psychotic break, possibly triggered by the mention of Tennessee and the emotional turmoil of his parents' separation. The defense painted a picture of a deeply troubled boy who had lost touch with reality in the moments leading up to the attack. The jury was not persuaded. On December 15, 2015, they found Phillip Chisholm guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and armed robbery. The verdict brought a measure of justice for Colleen Ritzer's family, though it could never bring her back. At sentencing, Phillip was given life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years for the murder conviction. He also received consecutive sentences totaling an additional 40 years for the rape and robbery charges. In effect, Phillip would serve a minimum of 40 years before he could even be considered for parole. He would be in his mid-50s before he had any chance of freedom. Colleen Ritzer's family has carried their grief with remarkable strength. They established a scholarship fund in her memory, supporting students who embody the kindness, dedication, and passion for learning that Colleen exemplified. They have spoken publicly about the need for better mental health screening in schools and for increased awareness of the warning signs that might indicate a student is in crisis. They have also made clear that they do not believe Phillip Chisholm should ever be released. For them, no amount of time in prison can undo the loss of their daughter, sister, and friend. Phillip Chisholm is currently incarcerated in a medium-security facility in Massachusetts. He will remain there for decades, serving out a sentence. That reflects the severity of his crimes. He will be 56 years old in 2055, the year he becomes eligible for parole. Whether he will be granted that parole is another question entirely. The attack on the corrections officer, the disturbing drawings, and the calculated nature of his crime all suggest that he remains a danger to others. The case of Phillip Chisholm raises deeply troubling questions. How does a 14-year-old boy with no prior history of violence commit such a brutal sexually violent crime? What was happening inside his mind that day, and why did an offhand mention of Tennessee seem to trigger such a catastrophic response? Was he suffering from a mental illness that went undetected? Or was there something darker at play, a capacity for violence that had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge? These are questions that may never be fully answered. What is clear is that Colleen Ritzer's murder shattered the illusion that schools are safe places, immune from the kind of violence that happens elsewhere. It also shattered the belief that quiet, polite students are necessarily safe students. Philip Chisholm was not the stereotypical troubled teen. He didn't have a history of disciplinary problems. He wasn't known for aggressive behavior. He was, by all outward appearances, a normal kid. And that is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his case. It reminds us that violence can hide behind a mask of normalcy, and that the warning signs are not always visible until it is too late. The memory of Colleen Ritzer lives on in the scholarship that bears her name, in the students whose lives she touched during her brief time as a teacher, and in the community of Danvers, which will never forget the young woman who was taken far too soon. Her death was a senseless tragedy, a loss that ripples through time and leaves an empty space that can never be filled. And the name Philip Chisholm will forever be associated with that loss. A reminder that even in a quiet Massachusetts town, in a school that felt safe, evil can enter through the door in the form of a polite, quiet teenager who no one suspected was capable of such horror. Case 5. Lionel Tate. On the evening of July 28, 1999, in a modest home in Broward County, Florida, two children were left to play together while the adult supervising them took a nap upstairs. One was 12-year-old Lionel Tate, a boy who stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed 166 pounds, unusually large for his age. The other was 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, a tiny girl who weighed just 48 pounds. The two were watching television in the living room, specifically a program featuring professional wrestling. Around 10:40 p.m., Lionel came upstairs to get his mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate, a Florida State Trooper who had been napping before her overnight shift. "Tiffany isn't breathing," he told her. When Kathleen rushed downstairs, she found Tiffany's small body lifeless on the floor. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. Tiffany Unick was dead. What followed would become one of the most controversial juvenile justice cases in American history, a case that raised agonizing questions about childhood violence, parental responsibility, and whether a 12-year-old boy could truly be held accountable for what happened that night. Lionel Tate was born on January 30, 1987, to Kathleen Grossett Tate, a single mother who worked long hours as a trooper with the Florida Highway Patrol. Lionel was always a large child, towering over his peers and developing physically at a rate that didn't match his emotional or intellectual maturity. Psychological evaluations would later reveal that Lionel had a below-average IQ and functioned at a level younger than his chronological age. He struggled in school, had difficulty with impulse control, and was described by those who knew him as immature for his age. Despite these challenges, Lionel was not known to be violent. He didn't have a history of hurting other children, and those who interacted with him saw him as a gentle giant, a kid who didn't fully understand his own size and strength. Tiffany Unick's mother, Deweese Unick Paul, had been friends with Kathleen Grossett Tate since childhood. The two women had grown up together in Jamaica and remained close after moving to the United States. When Deweese needed someone to watch Tiffany on the evening of July 28th, Kathleen agreed. It seemed like a safe arrangement. Kathleen was a law enforcement officer, responsible and trustworthy, and Lionel had played with Tiffany before without incident. Deweese had no reason to worry. Tiffany was excited to spend the evening at the Tate home. At 48 pounds, she was a small, delicate child, full of energy and joy. She had no way of knowing that she would never see her mother again. Kathleen fed the children dinner and then went upstairs to rest before her overnight shift. She told Lionel and Tiffany to play quietly in the living room, and she left them alone. Around 10 o'clock p.m., she yelled downstairs for them to be quiet, but she did not check on them. She did not go downstairs to see what they were doing or to ensure that Tiffany was safe. Roughly 40 minutes later, Lionel appeared at the top of the stairs. His demeanor was calm, almost detached. "Tiffany's not breathing," he said. Kathleen rushed downstairs and found Tiffany's small body on the floor. The child was not breathing, and there were visible signs of trauma. Kathleen called 911, and paramedics arrived quickly, but their efforts to revive Tiffany were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead shortly after. Investigators immediately began asking questions. What had happened during the time Kathleen was upstairs? How had a healthy 6-year-old girl died in less than an hour? The autopsy report provided horrifying answers. Tiffany Eunick had suffered a crushed skull, a lacerated liver, broken ribs, a fractured rib, and more than 35 internal bruises covering her body. Her liver had been so severely damaged that it had been pushed through her rib cage. The injuries were catastrophic, the kind of trauma typically seen in victims of severe car accidents or violent beatings. The medical examiner determined that the force required to inflict such injuries was consistent with Tiffany having been stomped on, kicked, and struck repeatedly. These were not the injuries of a child who had been accidentally hurt during rough play. These were the injuries of a child who had been brutally beaten. When police questioned Lionel about what had happened, his story was simple. He and Tiffany had been wrestling. He said he was imitating moves he had seen on WWE SmackDown, the professional wrestling program they had been watching. He claimed he had jumped from the stairs and landed on Tiffany's chest, mimicking a move he had seen on TV. It was an accident, he insisted. He didn't mean to hurt her, he was just playing, but the evidence didn't support that story. The autopsy findings made it clear that Tiffany's injuries were not the result of a single jump or accidental fall. They were the result of sustained, brutal violence. Forensic experts testified that the pattern of injuries, multiple broken bones, extensive bruising, a crushed skull, indicated that Tiffany had been beaten over a period of time, not injured in a single incident. At the time, Broward County Police described the case as one of the most brutal killings they had ever seen. Despite the severity of the evidence, Lionel's defense team argued that he was a child who didn't understand what he was doing. They pointed to his low IQ, his immaturity, and the fact that he had no history of violence. They suggested that Lionel, who was developmentally delayed, may have been playing too roughly without realizing the danger he was putting Tiffany in. They also blamed the influence of professional wrestling, arguing that Lionel had been imitating what he saw on television and didn't comprehend that real-life violence had real-life consequences. The case took a turn when Florida prosecutor Ken Padowitz made the decision to charge Lionel as an adult. Under Florida law, children as young as 12 could be tried as adults for certain violent crimes, and first-degree murder was one of them. Padowitz offered Lionel's family a plea deal, plead guilty to second-degree murder, and accept a sentence of 3 years in a juvenile facility. Lionel's mother, Kathleen, rejected the deal. She believed her son was innocent, that Tiffany's death had been a tragic accident, and that taking the case to trial would allow them to present evidence of Lionel's innocence. It was a decision that would prove disastrous. The trial began in January 2001. Lionel was 13 years old by then, but he was being tried as an adult for the murder of a 6-year-old girl. The prosecution presented the autopsy findings, expert testimony, and evidence that directly contradicted Lionel's claim that the death had been accidental. They argued that Lionel had intentionally hurt Tiffany, that the injuries were far too severe to have been caused by play, and that he should be held accountable. The defense maintained that Lionel was a child who had been imitating wrestling and that he lacked the intent necessary to commit murder. Under Florida law, the jury was instructed to consider the felony murder rule. This legal doctrine allows someone to be convicted of first-degree murder if a death occurs during the commission of another felony. even if the person didn't intend to kill anyone. In Lionel's case, the underlying felony was child abuse. Florida statutes defined child abuse as any intentional act that could reasonably be expected to result in physical injury to a child. Because the jury believed that Lionel had intentionally acted in a way that injured Tiffany, even if he didn't intend to kill her, they could convict him of first-degree murder without having to prove that he meant for her to die. On January 9, 2001, the jury found Lionel Tate guilty of first-degree murder. On March 9, 2001, Judge Joel T. Lazarus sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 14 years old, Lionel Tate became the youngest person in modern U.S. history to receive a life sentence. The courtroom was filled with grief, anger, and disbelief. Tiffany's family felt that justice had been served, though no sentence could bring her back. Lionel's family was devastated. Kathleen Grossett Tate, in tears, told reporters that she couldn't believe the judge had sentenced her son to die in prison. The case drew national and international attention. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, condemned the sentence as cruel and a violation of international law. They pointed out that sentencing a 12-year-old to life without parole violated the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the United States had not ratified. Critics argued that children are fundamentally different from adults. They lack the cognitive development, emotional maturity, and impulse control necessary to fully understand the consequences of their actions. Supporters of the sentence, however, argued that the brutality of the crime demanded serious consequences and that Lionel's age should not excuse him from accountability. The Parents Television Council and others attempted to blame professional wrestling for the death, arguing that violent programming influenced children to imitate dangerous behavior. The World Wrestling Federation, now WWE, filed a defamation lawsuit against the PTC, claiming that the accusations were false and damaging. The case was eventually settled, with the PTC paying $3.5 million and issuing a public apology, acknowledging that it was wrong to blame wrestling for Tiffany's death. The incident had been based on false information spread by people close to the Tate family. Lionel was held at a juvenile facility until he turned 18, at which point he would be transferred to an adult prison to serve the remainder of his life sentence. But in 2004, an appeals court overturned his conviction. The court ruled that Lionel's competency to stand trial had never been properly evaluated, and that his mental capacity at the time of the trial, whether he understood the charges against him and could assist in his own defense, should have been assessed before the trial proceeded. The court ordered a new trial. Facing the possibility of going through another trial, prosecutors and Lionel's defense team negotiated a new plea deal. Lionel agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, he was sentenced to time served. He had already spent 3 years in custody and was released on 10 years of probation in January 2004. The conditions of his probation were strict. He was required to stay out of trouble, avoid drugs and alcohol, and report regularly to his probation officer. If he violated any of these conditions, he would go back to prison. For a while, it seemed like Lionel might turn his life around. He was 17 years old when he was released, and he had the support of mentors, advocates, and organizations that worked with formerly incarcerated juveniles. But the transition from incarceration to the outside world proved difficult. Lionel struggled to adjust, and in May 2006, just 2 years after his release, he violated his probation in the most serious way possible. On May 23, 2006, Lionel Tate, now 19 years old, robbed a pizza delivery man at gunpoint. The victim was making a delivery in Broward County when Lionel approached him, pulled out a handgun, and demanded money. Lionel took the man's cash, his cell phone, and fled the scene. He was arrested shortly afterward. The robbery was a devastating blow to those who had advocated for his release and believed in his potential for rehabilitation. It also validated the fears of those who had argued that Lionel was dangerous and should never have been let out of prison. In March 2006, Lionel accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for violating his probation by possessing a gun and committing armed robbery. In February 2008, he also pled no contest to the robbery charge itself and received an additional 10-year sentence to be served concurrently with the 30-year sentence. Lionel Tate, who had once been the youngest person sentenced to life in prison, was now back behind bars, this time as an adult offender. Lionel is currently incarcerated at the South Bay Correctional Facility in Florida. His earliest possible release date is January 2031, when he will be 42 years old. By then he will have spent the vast majority of his adult life in prison. Whether he will be released at that time or whether he will remain incarcerated longer remains to be seen. The case of Lionel Tate raises agonizing questions that have no easy answers. Was Lionel a 12-year-old boy who accidentally killed a playmate during rough play, unable to comprehend his own strength? Or was he a violent child who brutally beat a 6-year-old girl to death and then lied about it? The autopsy evidence suggests the latter, but Lionel's age, low IQ, and lack of prior violence complicates the picture. Should a 12-year-old child be sentenced to life in prison for a crime he may not have fully understood? On the other hand, does the severity of the harm, a 6-year-old girl beaten to death, demand serious consequences regardless of the offender's age? And what about parental responsibility? Kathleen Grossett Tate left 2 children alone while she napped upstairs, despite the significant size difference between them. She did not check on them, did not supervise them, and did not intervene until it was too late. Critics have argued that Kathleen bears significant responsibility for Tiffany's death, that she failed in her duty to keep both children safe. At Lionel's later sentencing for the probation violation, his defense attorney, H. Don Williams, explicitly blamed Kathleen for many of Lionel's problems, both as a child and as an adult. He pointed out that she had left guns in the home that Lionel later stole and used in the robbery. The tragedy of Tiffany Eunick's death is compounded by the trajectory of Lionel Tate's life. He was given a second chance, a chance that many juvenile offenders never receive, and he squandered it by committing another violent crime. That reality has made his case a focal point in debates about juvenile justice. Supporters of harsh sentencing point to Lionel as proof that some young offenders are beyond rehabilitation, that releasing them poses a danger to society. Advocates for juvenile justice reform argue that Lionel's story is more complex, that he was released without adequate support, that his mental health issues were never properly addressed, and that the system failed him just as much as he failed society. Tiffany Eunick was 6 years old when she died. She was small, innocent, and full of life. She trusted the adults around her to keep her safe, and they failed her. Her mother, Deweese Eunick Paul, has lived with that loss every day since July 28, 1999. She has spoken publicly about the pain of losing her daughter, the inadequacy of the justice system's response, and her belief that Lionel Tate should never have been released in the first place. Tiffany's death was preventable. If Kathleen Grossett Tate had been supervising the children, if Lionel had never been left alone with a much smaller child, and if someone had recognized the danger, Tiffany might still be alive. Lionel Tate, now in his late 30s, has spent more than half his life incarcerated. He was a child when he killed Tiffany Eunick, but he was an adult when he robbed a pizza delivery man at gunpoint. Whether he is a victim of a broken system, a dangerous individual who should never be released, or something more complicated, is a question that people will answer differently depending on their perspective. What is undeniable is that 2 lives were destroyed on July 28, 1999. One ended in a brutal death, the other consumed by the consequences of that night. The memory of Tiffany Eunick lives on in the hearts of those who loved her. And the name Lionel Tate remains a symbol of one of the most controversial and tragic cases in the history of American juvenile justice. A reminder that violence can occur in the most unexpected places, that childhood is no guarantee of innocence, and that the question of how to hold children accountable for terrible acts is one we continue to struggle with as a society. Case 6. Joshua Phillips. On the afternoon of November 3, 1998, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton practiced piano after school, then asked her mother if she could go outside to play. It was just after 4:30 p.m. in their quiet Jacksonville neighborhood, where kids rode bikes and played until dinner. Maddie's mother watched from the window as her daughter headed to a neighbor's yard, then returned to her own driveway. Everything seemed normal. By 6:20 p.m., when Maddie didn't come home for dinner, everything changed. Her mother called 911 within minutes. By that evening, hundreds of volunteers flooded the neighborhood, searching yards, wooded areas, and streets. Among those volunteers was 14-year-old Joshua Phillips, the boy who lived directly across the street. Neighbors described him as a pretty decent kid. Maddie's own sister had played with him before and found nothing concerning. Witnesses who saw Joshua that night noted he looked as if he'd just taken a shower, but he appeared calm and helpful as he joined the search for the missing girl. The search continued for 7 days. Police canvassed the area repeatedly. Thousands of volunteers combed through the neighborhood. Joshua's parents participated in the effort. At one point, investigators even spoke with Joshua in his own bedroom, the very room where Maddie's body lay hidden. A detective who was present recalled that Joshua seemed completely unbothered by law enforcement being in his house. He sat on his bed petting his dog, showing no emotion or distress. It was chilling, the detective would later say, thinking about it after the truth came out. On November 10th, Joshua's mother noticed a foul smell coming from her son's room. She also spotted liquid seeping from beneath his waterbed. When she opened the bed frame, she discovered 2 small feet in white socks protruding from underneath. She immediately flagged down police officers who were still conducting investigations in the neighborhood. Inside the bed frame, investigators found Maddie's body. She had been beaten, stabbed, and left there for a week while her family searched desperately, and Joshua went about his daily routine. Joshua was picked up from school and taken to the police station. He confessed to killing Maddie, though his account of what happened raised as many questions as it answered. According to Joshua, Maddie had come to his house on November 3rd, asking him to play baseball, even though he wasn't supposed to have friends over when his parents weren't home. He agreed anyway. While playing in his front yard, Joshua said he accidentally hit Maddie in the eye with a baseball. She began to cry. Panicked that his father would punish him for having someone over and for hurting her, Joshua brought Maddie inside to stop her from making noise. What happened next, according to investigators, was far more violent than an attempt to quiet a crying child. The medical examiner determined that Maddie had been struck in the head at least 3 times with enough force to fracture her skull. She suffered fatal wounds to her neck that severed her windpipe, causing her to bleed to death or drown in her own blood. After she died, she was stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen. Evidence showed that when Joshua stuffed her body under the waterbed, Maddie was still clutching a bracket from the bed frame, indicating she was still alive at that moment. Joshua hid a baseball bat behind his dresser. He concealed the knife he had used. He placed air fresheners throughout his room to mask the smell. For 7 days, he slept on top of the waterbed, directly above Maddie's decomposing body. He went to school. He helped search for her. He spoke with investigators in that very room and showed no signs of distress or guilt. The question that haunted everyone who knew the case was simple. How? How could a 14-year-old boy do something so violent to a child he knew? How could he hide her body in such a cold, calculated manner, and how could he participate in the search while knowing exactly where she was? Joshua's defense team argued that he had acted out of fear. His father, they claimed, was abusive. Joshua had been conditioned to believe that any mistake would result in severe punishment. When Maddie started crying after being hit with the ball, Joshua panicked. What began as an accident spiraled into something unthinkable because he couldn't think clearly through his fear. His actions afterward, they suggested, were driven by that same terror. Prosecutors saw it differently: the level of violence, the stabbing after death, the methodical concealment, and the ability to function normally for a week all pointed to something beyond panic. This wasn't a child who made a terrible mistake in a moment of fear. This was someone who made deliberate choices, repeatedly, over the course of days. In 1999, Joshua Phillips was tried as an adult and convicted of first-degree murder. The trial lasted just 2 days. His defense called no witnesses. The jury took just over 2 hours to reach a guilty verdict. Because he was under 16, Joshua wasn't eligible for the death penalty, but he received the next harshest sentence available: life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 15 years old when a judge told him he would die behind bars. Over the years, even some who had been involved in prosecuting the case began to express doubts. Sheriff Nat Glover, who had originally advocated for the life sentence, later reflected that it was a tough punishment for someone that young. He never got the feeling that it was a malicious, mean-spirited, calculated murder. Given a different set of circumstances, he believed it would never have happened. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. The decision opened the door for Joshua to seek a new sentencing hearing. In 2017, he appeared before a judge again, nearly 2 decades after his conviction. Now in his 30s, he spoke directly to Maddie's family. He told them he had done something horrible and that he was deeply sorry. Maddie's mother, seated in the courtroom, had no interest in his apology. She wanted him to remain in prison for life. The judge resentenced Joshua to life in prison, but this time with a critical difference. His sentence would be reviewed after 25 years. That review became eligible in 2023. Court hearings have been scheduled to determine whether Joshua, now in his 40s, has demonstrated the maturity and rehabilitation necessary to justify a modified sentence or possible release. The case remains deeply divisive. Maddie's family continues to grieve the loss of a child who was heading home for dinner and never made it. They see no reason to grant mercy to the person who took her life and then hid her body while pretending to help search. For them, the sentence was appropriate then and remains appropriate now. Others point to Joshua's age at the time of the crime, his claims of an abusive home environment, and the question of whether panic and fear genuinely drove his actions. They note that brain science has shown adolescents lack the impulse control and judgment of adults. They argue that a 14-year-old, even one who commits a terrible act, is not beyond redemption. What no one disputes is the horror of what happened. An 8-year-old girl went outside to play and never came home. A teenage boy made choices that destroyed 2 families and left a community searching for answers that may never fully satisfy. The question of whether Joshua Phillips should spend the rest of his life in prison or whether he deserves a chance at freedom after nearly 3 decades remains unresolved. But the memory of Maddie Clifton and the 7 days her body lay hidden while her family searched will never fade. Case 7, Eric Smith. On the morning of August 2, 1993, 4-year-old Derek Roby was ready for summer camp. He had attended the recreation program at a park near his home in Savona all summer long, and his mother usually walked him the short distance down their street. But that morning, Derek's baby brother was crying, and Derek insisted he could make the trip alone. It was only 1 block away, same side of the street. His mother watched from the window as he set off, his little legs hopping along the sidewalk. She called out that she loved him. He called back that he loved her too. It was the last time she would see him alive. By early afternoon, storm clouds rolled in and it began to rain. Derek's mother went to pick him up from the park, but staff told her he had never arrived. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers flooded the small town of Savona, searching for the missing boy. Just before 4:30 p.m., searchers found Derek's body in a small patch of woods, only a few yards from the park and a few hundred yards from his own front door. What had been done to him was almost incomprehensible. Derek had been lured off the sidewalk and strangled until he lost consciousness. Then someone had found a 26-pound rock and dropped it on his head over and over. His skull was fractured. His face was battered beyond recognition. After he was dead, his attacker sodomized his body with a stick. A banana from Derek's lunch bag had been smashed and left near the scene. His Kool-Aid had been poured into the wounds on his body. The brutality was so extreme that investigators initially assumed the killer had to be an adult, likely someone from outside the community. No one in this quiet town could imagine a local resident, much less a child, doing something so savage to a 4-year-old. But as the investigation continued, attention turned to a 13-year-old boy named Eric Smith. Eric lived in Savona and was known around town, though not always in positive ways. He had been relentlessly bullied for years because of his appearance. He had red hair, thick glasses, and was shorter than most kids his age. Other children targeted him constantly. They mocked his ears, his glasses, his height, his hair. The bullying was severe and unrelenting. At home, Eric later said, things weren't much better. He described a household marked by domestic abuse and anger that he didn't know how to process. On the day Derek disappeared, a neighbor's grandmother had seen Eric riding his bike near where Derek was walking. She watched as Eric approached the little boy. She didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just two kids talking. She went back inside her home. What happened next, Eric would later confess, was an explosion of rage that had been building for years. Eric told investigators he lured Derek into the woods by promising to show him a shortcut. Derek, trusting and small, followed him. Once they were out of sight, Eric wrapped his arm around Derek's neck and lifted him off the ground until the boy lost consciousness. Then Eric found the large rock and used it to crush Derek's skull. Even after Derek was clearly dead, Eric continued. He violated the boy's body. He took Derek's lunch and destroyed it, pouring the drink into the wounds he had inflicted. Eric later described the moment with chilling clarity. He said he had been angry for so long, bullied and abused for so long, that he finally snapped. Derek hadn't done anything to him. Derek was innocent. But Eric saw an opportunity to stop being the victim and become something else. In that moment, he took out years of pain and rage on a child who couldn't fight back. When police arrested Eric, the town was stunned. This wasn't some adult predator. This was a freckle-faced, red-haired boy in thick glasses who looked more like a victim than a killer. The disconnect between his appearance and his crime was so jarring that it almost worked in his favor. Some people couldn't reconcile the image of this small, bullied teenager with the monstrous violence he had committed. In August 1994, Eric Smith was tried as an adult. He was 14 years old by then. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing whether Eric's history of being bullied and his claims of mental illness should excuse what he had done. Prosecutors argued that, regardless of Eric's suffering, he had made a choice. He knew right from wrong. He had chosen to kill. The jury agreed. They convicted him of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to the maximum term available for juvenile offenders, 9 years to life. Derek's parents, Dale and Doreen Roby, sobbed with relief when the verdict was read. But they didn't realize they were being sentenced too. When they heard 9 years to life, they focused on the life portion, assuming Eric would never be released. It wasn't until later that the reality set in. Eric would be eligible for parole in 9 years, and every 2 years after that, the Robys would have to relive their worst nightmare. Eric's first parole hearing came in 2002. He was 22 years old. The parole board noted that he showed little remorse and denied his release. 2 years later, another hearing, another denial, and again and again. For nearly 2 decades, the Robys wrote letters and made videos, begging the parole board not to release the person who had murdered their son. They described the ongoing pain, the way Derek's absence haunted every family gathering, every holiday, every moment of their lives. In prison, Eric Smith was described as a model inmate. He participated in therapy for years. He earned educational certifications. He worked to understand why he had committed such a horrific act. In interviews, he expressed deep remorse. He acknowledged that no amount of bullying or abuse excused what he had done to Derek. He said that if he could switch places with Derek and take the grave himself, he would do it in a second. But for many years, the parole board wasn't convinced. They cited concerns for public safety. They acknowledged the Robys' opposition. They noted the sheer brutality of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. Parole was denied again and again. In October 2021, Eric Smith appeared before the parole board for the 11th time. He was 41 years old. He had been incarcerated for 27 years, nearly twice as long as he had been alive when he committed the crime. At this hearing, Eric revealed that he was engaged to a woman he had met through correspondence. She was studying to be a lawyer and had written to him with questions about the juvenile justice system. Over time, they fell in love. Eric told the board he had plans for his future. He wanted to work in electrical installation or carpentry. He wanted to prove he was not a threat to society. The parole board reviewed his record. They noted his clean disciplinary history. They considered his rehabilitation efforts. They looked at his risk assessment scores, which were low. And, for the first time, they granted him parole. The news devastated the Roby family. Doreen Roby said she doesn't let Eric take up space in her head anymore, but the decision to release him reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The community of Savona was divided. Some residents held a peaceful protest, making it clear they didn't want Eric back in their town. Others believed that 27 years of rehabilitation and a clean record in prison demonstrated that Eric had changed. Eric Smith was released from prison in February 2022. His release was delayed for months because he had difficulty securing approved housing. He eventually relocated to Queens, New York, far from Savona and far from the Roby family. He has kept a low profile since his release. The questions raised by Eric Smith's case remain difficult and unresolved. There is no disputing the horror of what he did. A 4-year-old boy was brutally murdered by a teenager who later admitted he wanted to stop being a victim and become someone powerful. The violence was excessive, ritualistic, and targeted at the most vulnerable imaginable victim. Derek Roby's family will carry that loss for the rest of their lives. But there is also no disputing that Eric Smith was 13 years old when he committed the crime. He was a child who had been bullied relentlessly and, by his account, abused at home. He was a victim who became a victimizer. Over nearly 3 decades in prison, he worked to understand what he had done and why. He expressed remorse. He built a plan for his future. He demonstrated by every available measure that he was no longer the angry, damaged 13-year-old who killed Derek Roby. The question becomes, is that enough? Should a person who commits such a brutal crime as a child ever be released, no matter how much they change? Or does the fact that Eric was 13 at the time mean that rehabilitation was always possible, even necessary? The parole board decided yes. Derek's family says no. And in a small town in upstate New York, a memorial stands on a hill overlooking a ball field built in Derek's memory. A plaque reads, "Dedicated to be a gentle reminder of what childhood is meant to be." The contrast between that innocence and what happened to Derek Roby continues to haunt everyone who remembers the case. Case 8. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. On the evening of September 21, 2006, two 16-year-old boys sat in a car with a video camera running. Brian Draper held the camera from the passenger seat while Tori Adamczyk drove through the streets of Pocatello. They were recording what they believed would become a documentary about their transformation into serial killers. "We found our victim," Draper announced to the camera, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "And sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices." Adamczyk interrupted, focused on the road ahead. "God, turn your brights off, asshole!" he shouted at a passing car. Draper continued, barely able to contain himself. "Our first victim is going to be Cassie Stoddart. We'll find out if she has friends over, if she's going to be alone in a big dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? I mean, holy shit, dude!" Adamczyk responded with chilling casualness. "I'm horny just thinking about it." The two laughed. They discussed their plans. They talked about killing Cassie and her friends, then moving on to other targets. They had already started a list. This was just the beginning of what they envisioned as their legacy. The next night, September 22nd, Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle at their home on Whispering Cliffs Drive in Tyhee, just outside Pocatello. Cassie was a junior at Pocatello High School, known for being responsible, smart, and kind. Her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, came over around 6 in the evening to keep her company while she looked after the family's cats and dogs. It was supposed to be a quiet, normal night. Around 8:20 p.m., two of their classmates showed up. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk said they wanted to hang out. Cassie knew them both. They were friends, or at least friendly enough that their arrival wasn't concerning. The four teenagers settled in to watch a movie. Cassie gave Brian and Tori a tour of the house, showing them the layout, including the basement. They watched Kill Bill, Volume 2, together. Shortly after 9:30 p.m., Brian told the group he needed to leave. Tori said he would go too. They said goodbye and left through the front door. Cassie and Matt continued watching the movie. About 15 minutes later, the power in the house went out. The sudden darkness was unsettling, but Matt called his mother to ask if he could stay the night. His mother said no. He needed to come home. Reluctantly, Matt left Cassie alone in the dark house and walked home. What Cassie didn't know was that Brian and Tori hadn't left. They had circled back to the house, cut the power at the breaker box outside, and waited. They wore black clothing and masks to conceal their identities. They carried knives. And they had their video camera ready to document what came next. Once Matt was gone and Cassie was alone, Brian and Tori entered the house. Cassie, likely frightened by the darkness and strange noises, had no chance to defend herself. The two boys attacked her with knives, stabbing her repeatedly. The medical examiner would later count 29 stab wounds on Cassie's body. All of the fatal wounds came from a serrated blade associated with Brian Draper. The attack was prolonged and vicious. Cassie fought for her life, but against two attackers with knives, she had no way to escape. After Cassie was dead, Brian and Tori left the house. They didn't call for help. They didn't express remorse. Instead, they retrieved their video camera and recorded themselves again. This time, they were giddy with adrenaline. They talked about what they had just done. They discussed their alibis. Tori told Brian to get rid of the clothing and knives. They were calm, methodical, and pleased with themselves. They buried the evidence, including the blood-stained clothing and weapons, in a remote area near Black Rock Canyon south of Pocatello. Cassie's body wasn't discovered until September 24th, when her aunt and uncle returned home. They found her on the floor, missing a finger, surrounded by blood. The scene was horrific. The small, quiet community of Pocatello was immediately thrown into shock and fear. Murders like this didn't happen here. Investigators initially focused on Matt Beckham, Cassie's boyfriend. His lack of visible emotion during questioning raised red flags, but Matt passed a polygraph test with flying colors. During his interview, he mentioned something that would change the course of the investigation. He told detectives that two other students, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, had also been at the house that night. When police interviewed Brian and Tori, the boys claimed they had gone to a movie after leaving Cassie's house. But when asked what the movie was about, neither could provide any details. An employee at the local theater confirmed that neither boy had been there that night. Their alibi fell apart immediately. Confronted with the inconsistencies, Brian Draper began to crack. He asked to speak with detectives privately, with his parents present. He admitted that he and Tori had returned to the house that night. They had turned off the power to scare Cassie. They wore masks to disguise themselves, but Brian claimed he was shocked when Tori started stabbing her. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said through tears. "It was supposed to be a joke." Brian led investigators to the burial site near Black Rock Canyon. Among the buried items, police found a videotape. The tape had been partially burned, but enough remained intact to be recovered. What investigators saw on that tape was unlike anything they had encountered before. The video showed two teenage boys openly discussing their plan to murder their classmate. It showed them excited about the prospect of killing. It revealed that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act or a joke gone wrong. This was premeditated murder, carefully planned and eagerly anticipated. The tape also revealed something even more disturbing. Cassie wasn't going to be their only victim. Brian and Tori had created a death list with the names of a dozen other students. They talked about committing a Columbine-style school shooting. Their goal wasn't just to kill Cassie. Their goal was to become infamous serial killers. Both boys were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They were tried as adults in separate trials. The video evidence was damning. The premeditation was undeniable. Prosecutors argued that Brian and Tori had been living in their own personal horror movie fantasy, obsessed with films like Scream, and determined to recreate that violence in real life. The defense tried to argue that the boys' youth should be considered. They pointed to the fact that adolescent brains aren't fully developed, that teenagers are more susceptible to peer influence and poor impulse control. But the videos made it nearly impossible to argue that these boys didn't understand what they were doing. They had planned it. They had documented it. They had expressed excitement about it. And after they killed Cassie, they had planned to kill again. In 2007, both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were convicted of first-degree murder. Because they were 16 at the time of the crime, they were not eligible for the death penalty. Instead, they received mandatory sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge who sentenced them stated clearly that he believed if they were ever released, they would kill again. Cassie's family was devastated but relieved that the boys would never be free. Her grandparents, Paul and Josefina Cisneros, attended every hearing, every appeal, every court appearance. They told the court that Cassie's civil rights had been permanently violated. They pleaded for the sentences to stand. Over the years, both Brian and Tori filed multiple appeals. They argued that life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, pointing to Supreme Court rulings that mandatory life sentences for juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Their attorneys claimed the boys deserved a chance at rehabilitation, that they were capable of change. The courts disagreed. In 2017, the Idaho Supreme Court upheld both sentences. The court noted that while the boys were juveniles at the time of the crime, the sentencing judge had considered their age, their backgrounds, and the nature of the offense. The judge had found that this was one of those rare cases where life without parole was appropriate. The barbarous, cold-blooded, horrific nature of the crime, combined with the clear evidence that they intended to kill again, justified the harshest available sentence. Today, both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk remain incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institution. They are now in their 30s. Brian has expressed remorse in interviews, saying he felt like a nobody at the time of the crime and thought he would become somebody if he did something big and bad. He says he thinks about what he did all the time and would do anything to change it. Tori has remained largely silent, though his attorneys continue to argue that he was less culpable than Brian and that the fatal wounds came from Brian's knife. The case became known as the Scream Killings, a reference to the horror film franchise that inspired the boys. It was featured in the documentary Lost for Life, which examined juveniles serving life sentences without parole. The case continues to be cited in debates about juvenile sentencing, media violence, and whether children who commit calculated murders can ever truly be rehabilitated. What makes this case particularly chilling is the video evidence. Most juvenile murder cases involve trying to piece together what happened based on testimony and physical evidence. But Brian and Tori documented their intentions and their mindset with their own voices and their own words. There is no ambiguity about whether they understood what they were doing. There is no question about whether this was premeditated. They told the camera exactly what they planned to do, and then they did it. The question that remains is whether two 16-year-olds who were obsessed with horror movies and convinced they wanted to be serial killers should spend the rest of their lives in prison. Are they irredeemable? Or were they children shaped by violent media and adolescent fantasies who might have grown out of those impulses if given the chance? The judge who sentenced them believed they would kill again. Cassie's family believes they should never be free. The law has repeatedly affirmed that life without parole is appropriate in this case. But somewhere in an Idaho prison, two men in their 30s continue to serve sentences for crimes they committed as teenagers, knowing they will never leave. Cassie Jo Stoddart was 16 years old when she died. She was alone in a dark house, betrayed by people she thought were friends. Her family will never see her graduate, get married, or have children. And two boys who wanted to become famous killers will spend the rest of their lives behind bars, their names forever linked to the horror they created. Case 9. Michael Hernandez. On the morning of February 3, 2004, 14-year-old Michael Hernandez arrived at Southwood Middle School before classes began. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another student starting another ordinary day. Michael was a straight-A student, well-behaved, and seemingly well-adjusted. Teachers had no concerns about him. His parents believed he was on a good path. Even his closest friends saw nothing alarming in his behavior. But Michael Hernandez had a secret. He kept a detailed journal in which he wrote about his fascination with serial killers. He studied Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer obsessively. He researched their methods, their motivations, their crimes. In his journal, Michael wrote that he felt called to a mission. He believed he needed to cleanse the planet by killing people. He had created a hit list of potential victims, and on that list were the names of classmates, acquaintances, and even his own sister. That morning, Michael had brought a knife to school. It was concealed in a hidden compartment in his backpack, a space he had prepared specifically for this purpose. He had a plan, and he was ready to carry it out. Michael's first target was a classmate named Andre Martin. Before school started, Michael approached Andre and suggested they go into the bathroom together. He wanted to show Andre something, he said. Andre, sensing something wasn't right, hesitated. The request felt strange. He made an excuse and walked away. Michael didn't push it. He simply moved on to his backup plan. His second choice was Jamie Goff, his best friend. Jamie was also 14, a talented student who played the violin and earned excellent grades. He trusted Michael completely. When Michael asked Jamie to come with him into the handicapped bathroom stall, Jamie didn't question it. They were friends. There was no reason to be suspicious. Once inside the stall, Michael pulled out the knife. He attacked Jamie with shocking speed and violence. He stabbed him over and over more than 40 times. He slit Jamie's throat. The attack was prolonged and brutal. Jamie had no chance to defend himself or call for help. When Michael was certain Jamie was dead, he calmly placed the blood-covered knife back into the hidden compartment of his backpack. He washed his hands, he left the bathroom, and he went to class. It wasn't until later that Jamie's body was discovered in the bathroom stall. The scene was horrific. A teacher noticed blood on Michael's clothing and alerted authorities. When questioned, Michael confessed almost immediately. He didn't try to deny what he had done. In fact, he spoke about it in cold, clinical detail, describing the attack as if he were discussing a science experiment rather than the murder of his closest friend. Investigators searched Michael's belongings and his home. What they found was deeply disturbing. Michael's journal contained page after page of violent fantasies and plans. He had written about his desire to become a serial killer. He had listed the names of people he wanted to kill. He had studied other killers and taken notes on their techniques. His computer history revealed searches related to serial killers, torture methods, and murder. He had even downloaded phone apps that cataloged information about infamous killers and listed various torture devices. Perhaps most chilling was a notebook found in his possession. Inside were quotes that revealed Michael's mindset. One read, "You can't spell laughter without slaughter." Another entry detailed his belief that he was on a mission to rid the world of certain people. He saw himself as someone destined for infamy, someone who would be remembered long after his death. When Michael was arrested, investigators asked him why he had killed Jamie. His response was unsettling. He said he wanted to know what it felt like. He wanted to experience killing someone. Jamie hadn't done anything to deserve it. Jamie was simply available, trusting, and vulnerable. Michael chose him not out of anger or revenge, but out of curiosity and a desire to begin his career as a serial killer. The case shocked the South Florida community. Parents struggled to understand how a 14-year-old honor student with no disciplinary record could commit such a horrific crime. Teachers who had worked with Michael expressed disbelief. He had been polite, engaged, and seemingly normal. There had been no outward signs of violence or instability. The disconnect between his public persona and his private obsessions was complete. Michael Hernandez was charged as an adult with first-degree murder and attempted murder for his failed attempt to lure Andre Martin into the bathroom. At trial, his defense team argued that Michael was mentally ill. They brought in experts who testified that he suffered from severe mental illness, possibly paranoid schizophrenia or delusional disorder. His attorneys claimed that he was not legally sane at the time of the murder and should not be held fully responsible for his actions. The prosecution disagreed. They presented their own mental health experts who testified that while Michael had mental health issues, he met the legal definition of sanity. He knew what he was doing. He understood that it was wrong. He had planned it carefully, concealing his weapon, choosing a location, and selecting victims. He had acted with deliberation and intent. The fact that he had a fascination with serial killers didn't mean he was unable to control his behavior. It meant he had chosen to act on that fascination. The jury rejected the insanity defense. In 2008, Michael Hernandez was convicted of first-degree murder. Because he was 14 at the time of the crime, he was not eligible for the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. The judge also imposed an additional 30 years for the attempted murder of Andre Martin, to be served consecutively. Michael's mother addressed the court, turning to the Goff family and telling them she was sorry. But she also said her son suffered from severe mental illness and didn't deserve to die in prison. She called it the juvenile death penalty. Jaime's father, Jorge Goff, spoke to the court as well. He looked Michael in the eye and asked the question that haunted everyone. How could you? Jaime had trusted Michael. They were friends, and Michael had murdered him in the most brutal way imaginable. Despite the life sentence, the Goff family said they had forgiven Michael. Forgiveness, they explained, didn't mean they thought he should be released. It meant they were choosing not to let hatred consume them. They still believed Michael should remain in prison for the rest of his life, but they didn't want to carry the burden of rage and bitterness. Their forgiveness was for their own peace, not for Michael's benefit. In 2016, following a Supreme Court ruling that juveniles could not receive mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole, Michael Hernandez received a second sentencing hearing. His attorneys argued that he had changed during his years in prison, that he deserved a chance at eventual release. The prosecution presented evidence that Michael remained obsessed with violent imagery and music that glorified death and murder. Jailhouse recordings captured Michael making jokes about his inability to cry and discussing plans to fake remorse. In one recorded call, he laughed about needing to stab himself to produce tears during his sentencing hearing. The judge was not convinced that Michael had changed. In 2016, he was resentenced to life in prison with a review after 25 years. The life sentence was upheld again in 2018 by the 3rd District Court of Appeals. Michael would remain behind bars. On May 1, 2021, Michael Hernandez collapsed in prison. He was 31 years old. Surveillance video captured the moment he fell, and investigators found no evidence of foul play. An autopsy later revealed that Michael had a pre-existing heart condition. He died of natural causes. His death came before he would have been eligible for his 25-year sentence review. The news of Michael's death reached the Goff family unexpectedly. Jorge Goff said he was shocked. He hadn't been expecting it at all. His wife, Maria, said she couldn't stop crying. It was very sad, she said. Even after everything Michael had done, even after the years of pain and loss, the Goffs felt sadness at the news of his death. They were hurt, Jorge explained, and they didn't want to see anyone die or be hurt like that. Andre Martin, the student who had survived Michael's attempt to lure him into the bathroom, had gone on to become a Miami-Dade police detective. He heard about Michael's death through an automated message from the prison informing him that the inmate's custody status had changed. He expressed mixed feelings. His thoughts were with the Goff family, he said, but also with the Hernandez family. They were not the ones who committed a crime, and they had lost a family member too. The case of Michael Hernandez raises difficult questions about juvenile crime, mental illness, and the capacity for evil in children. Michael was not an impulsive teenager who made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger. He was a calculated, methodical individual who planned and executed a murder because he wanted to become a serial killer. He kept lists of future victims. He studied the methods of infamous killers. He saw himself as destined for notoriety. At the same time, Michael was 14 years old when he committed the crime. His brain was not fully developed. His defense team argued that he suffered from severe mental illness that distorted his thinking. His mother pleaded for the court to see him as a mentally ill child rather than a competent adult. The courts ultimately decided that Michael's mental illness did not excuse his behavior. He was capable of understanding right and wrong. He chose to act. And Jaime Goff, a talented, kind, trusting 14-year-old, paid the price for that choice. Michael Hernandez died in prison without ever experiencing freedom as an adult. He never had the chance to prove whether he had truly changed or whether the violent obsessions that drove him at 14 would have defined him for life. Jamie Goff never had the chance to grow up at all. His family still talks about him, still wonders what he would have become. A professional, maybe, a husband and father. So many possibilities, all taken away in a school bathroom by someone who was supposed to be his friend. The question of whether Michael Hernandez was a victim of mental illness or a calculating predator may never be fully answered. What is certain is that 2 families were destroyed by what happened that February morning, and the community of Southwood Middle School was forced to confront the reality that sometimes the most dangerous person in a school is the one no one suspects at all. Case 10. Christian Fernandez. Christian Fernandez was born in Miami in 1999 to a mother who was 12 years old. His father was 25. The man received 10 years of probation for sexually assaulting a child. That was how Christian's life began. When Christian was 2 years old, he was found wandering a South Florida street, naked and filthy, at 4 in the morning. His grandmother, who was supposed to be caring for him, had locked herself in a nearby motel room with cocaine. His 14-year-old mother was nowhere to be found. Authorities placed both mother and son in foster care. It was the first intervention in what would become a lifetime of failed systems and missed opportunities. Over the years, Christian moved between homes and caregivers. His mother, Bianella Susana, struggled with addiction and instability. Records show that Child Protective Services had repeated contact with the family. When Christian was 8 years old, he was sexually assaulted by an older cousin. Later, he endured beatings from his stepfather. Before police investigating those beatings could arrive, the stepfather committed suicide. Christian witnessed the aftermath. By the time he was 12 years old, Christian Fernandez had experienced more trauma than many people endure in a lifetime. He had been neglected, abused, sexually assaulted, and exposed to violence and death. He had learned early that the world was not safe, that adults could not be trusted, and that survival often meant suppressing feelings and moving forward. A counselor who worked with him noted that Christian had learned to suck up feelings and get over it. In March 2011, Christian was living with his mother and his 2-year-old half-brother David Galarraga in an apartment in Jacksonville. Bianella left Christian alone with David and their younger sister while she went out. What happened while she was gone would change all of their lives forever. According to the account Christian gave to authorities, he was in the apartment with David when the toddler began to misbehave. There was an altercation. In a moment of anger or frustration, Christian slammed David's head into a bookshelf. The impact was severe. David sustained a traumatic head injury that left him unconscious. When Bianella returned home and found David unresponsive, she did not call for help immediately. Medical experts would later testify that if David had received prompt medical attention, he might have survived. But Bianella waited. She waited 8 hours before finally taking the child to the hospital. By then, it was too late. David died from his injuries 2 days later. Christian was arrested and charged with murder. Bianella was charged with aggravated manslaughter for her role in delaying medical care. The case quickly became one of the most controversial and complex in Florida's legal history. State Attorney Angela Corey made the decision to charge Christian as an adult with first-degree murder. If convicted, he faced a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 12 years old, Christian became the youngest person in Duval County history to face such charges. He was held in an adult detention facility, awaiting trial. The decision to prosecute a 12-year-old as an adult sparked immediate and intense debate. Advocacy groups, legal experts, and members of the public questioned whether it was appropriate to treat a child with Christian's history as if he were a fully responsible adult. A Facebook page was created in his defense. A petition at change.org gathered more than 194,000 signatures calling for him to be tried as a juvenile. Supporters argued that Christian was not a monster. He was a child who had been failed by every system meant to protect him. Carol Torres, whose grandson attended school with Christian, said he was a very sweet kid. She believed the system was taking advantage of a child. Others echoed that sentiment, pointing to the extensive documentation of abuse, neglect, and trauma in Christian's short life. They argued that he needed rehabilitation and mental health treatment, not a life sentence in an adult prison. But the case was not simple. A 2-year-old child was dead. David Galarraga had his entire life ahead of him, and that life was taken by someone who was supposed to protect him. Prosecutors argued that regardless of Christian's past, he had committed an act of violence that resulted in a toddler's death. The community deserved accountability. The legal proceedings became even more complicated when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. This decision, known as Miller v. Alabama, created uncertainty in Christian's case. His defense attorneys argued that because Florida law required a life sentence for first-degree murder, and because that sentence was now unconstitutional for juveniles, Christian could not be properly advised of the potential consequences he faced. They moved to have the charges dismissed. The judge denied the motion. He ruled that the Miller decision did not prohibit life without parole for juveniles entirely. It only prohibited mandatory life sentences. A judge could still impose life without parole after considering the juvenile's age and circumstances. The case would proceed. As the trial date approached, a team of prominent defense attorneys joined Christian's case, many working pro bono. Among them was Melissa Nelson, who would later defeat Angela Corey in the race for state attorney, in part because of the controversy surrounding this case. The defense team included high-profile attorney Hank Cox, who became deeply invested in Christian's future. In August 2012, a judge ruled that police interrogations of Christian were inadmissible because the boy could not knowingly waive his rights to remain silent and consult an attorney. This was a significant blow to the prosecution's case. Without Christian's statements, proving first-degree murder would be far more difficult. In 2013, after extensive negotiations, a plea agreement was reached. Christian pleaded guilty to manslaughter and aggravated battery. He was sentenced to time served in a juvenile facility, plus 8 years of probation. If he violated probation, he would face 15 years in an adult prison. The agreement allowed Christian to remain in the juvenile system, where he could receive counseling, education, and mental health treatment. State Attorney Angela Corey defended the decision. She said that Christian needed to be punished for his actions, but he also needed rehabilitation that went beyond what the juvenile system typically provided. Critics argued that charging him as an adult in the first place had been unnecessary and cruel, and that the plea deal simply undid damage that should never have been done. Bianella Susana, Christian's mother, received a very different outcome. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was credited with 2 years and 4 months of time already served. The judge then suspended her remaining sentence to probation. She served no additional prison time for waiting 8 hours to seek medical help for her dying son. Christian spent the next several years in juvenile detention facilities. During that time, he found an unlikely support system. Mary Cox, the wife of his attorney Hank Cox, became Christian's court-appointed guardian ad litem and, as she described it, his honorary grandmother. For over 2 years, she made the 132-mile journey every Saturday to spend 3 hours with him. She became one of the few stable, supportive adults in his life. On January 15, 2018, the day after his 19th birthday, Christian Fernandez was released from custody. He had served 7 years. The Florida Department of Juvenile Justice could not by law confirm or deny his release, but court records showed that he was free to begin the 8-year probation period. If he successfully completed probation, he would be 27 years old and able to move forward with his life. If he violated probation, he would be sent to adult prison to serve 15 years. The case of Christian Fernandez is unlike any other on this list. It forces the most difficult question of all. Can a child who has known nothing but trauma, abuse, and violence be held to the same standard of accountability as a child who grew up in safety and stability? Christian was born to a child who had been raped. He was neglected as a toddler, found wandering the streets alone. He was sexually assaulted. He was beaten. He watched his stepfather's suicide. By the age of 12, he had experienced a lifetime of horrors. He had no model for healthy relationships, no understanding of appropriate behavior, no sense of safety or security. He learned that violence was normal, that adults were unreliable, and that survival meant shutting down emotionally. When he killed his 2-year-old brother, was he making a choice in the way a child from a stable home would understand choice? Or was he acting out patterns of violence that had been programmed into him from birth? If every adult in his life had failed him, if every system meant to protect him had overlooked or ignored his suffering, how much responsibility could he bear for becoming what his environment made him? These are not easy questions. David Galarraga is dead. He was 2 years old. He deserved protection, safety, and a chance to grow up. His death was a tragedy that cannot be undone. Holding someone accountable for that death is not wrong, but the question is how. And at what point does punishment become just another form of systemic failure? Dale Carson, a legal expert who followed the case, said that as tragic as it was, the legal system had limited options. Christian had been abused when he was younger, and in turn he abused others. Even 7 years of incarceration couldn't fix that, Carson said. You can't simply go back and undo a childhood of trauma. Christian's case became a centerpiece of juvenile justice reform debates. It highlighted the failures of child protective services, the inadequacy of mental health resources for children in crisis, and the question of whether the criminal justice system should be the primary response to children who have been victimized and then victimize others. Angela Corey, who charged Christian as an adult, lost her re-election campaign in 2016. Her opponent, Melissa Nelson, who had been part of Christian's defense team, won in part by arguing that the criminal justice system should focus on rehabilitation for juveniles, especially those with histories like Christian's. Today, Christian Fernandez is an adult. He served his time in juvenile facilities. He was released under strict probation conditions. Whether he will successfully complete probation and build a stable, productive life remains to be seen. His story is not one of a child who was born evil or who chose violence for its own sake. It is the story of a child shaped entirely by the worst humanity has to offer, and the question of whether justice, mercy, and rehabilitation can coexist when a life begins in such darkness. David Galarraga will never have the chance to grow up. Christian Fernandez will carry the weight of that reality for the rest of his life. And the systems that failed both of them continue to grapple with how to prevent the next tragedy. Knowing that as long as children grow up in environments of abuse, neglect, and violence, cases like this will happen again. These 10 students, they transformed from children with futures into murderers with victims, whether driven by untreated mental illness, unfathomable cruelty, or circumstances we may never understand. Their actions left permanent scars on families, communities, and our national consciousness. Some are serving decades or life. Some died by their own hands. One was exonerated, his childhood stolen by wrongful accusation. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Children can kill. Justice for juveniles remains imperfect. and the line between rehabilitation and retribution blurs when the perpetrator is still in braces. As we remember the 50-plus victims who lost their lives and the hundreds more whose lives were forever altered, we must ask ourselves, how do we protect children from themselves while ensuring those harmed receive justice? Which of these cases shocked you the most? The I Don't Like Mondays killer or the teen who showed zero remorse in court? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this documentary eye-opening, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime's most disturbing cases. Remember to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.